Hello everyone, this is Tydrous. Today I'm going to be taking you through the remix entry that I did for the Seven Lions remix competition for his track Only Now. I'm going to be doing something a little different than the normal track walkthrough, where I take you through the different versions of the project as I kind of worked on it. So all the way from the first project that I have with the initial ideas as I was working on the remix to the finished version that I submitted to the remix competition. And the full version of that track can be found on my SoundCloud page. I'll link it down below. But yeah, if you have any interest in checking out that final version, please feel free to give it a listen. So with that, let's get right into the first project. Alright, so here's the first version of my Only Now remix. So as of right now, there's not a whole lot to it quite yet. I just have kind of the intro section done, just sort of sketching out some ideas. And the first thing I started with was kind of lining up this vocal that was provided for the remix, just to see like kind of where I wanted it to come in. And I just had a couple of ideas that I wanted to start with, one of which was having like a very atmospheric piano sound kind of floating in the intro section, as well as a lot of these sort of atmospheric elements. So I'll kind of play it here from the start to around this section here and give you kind of an idea of what it sounds like right now. So that's the basic gist of it so far. Main things are this sort of atmosphere that I've got here at the beginning, which is just a layer, a lot of elements layered together. So I've got kind of this main atmospheric pad that's doing most of the work, and then I've got some other kind of atmospheric elements here. So this is like a vocal atmosphere that I kind of pitched around and stretched a bit. As well as this water sample, kind of gives it that space and makes it sound kind of cool. Then I got this other atmosphere. This is like a wind sort of atmosphere. Kind of sounds like a that sort of wind sound you get in like a castle. So I really like that, and I kind of layered them together, as well as these other kind of pitch bended effects. Which just add to the atmosphere even more and kind of make you feel like you're in a space. Next element was this kind of atmospheric piano. And this is the Maverick by Native Instruments with just a whole bunch of reverb and some ping pong delay on it. So I've got a Valhalla Shimmer and a Valhalla Vintage Verb, both really great reverb plugins that I like to kind of put in tandem with one another, and they create a really cool atmospheric sound. And I change around this piano melody here a bit more as we get later in the project. The next main element were the sort of strings that were coming in. And these are pretty much straight whole notes as of right now, or I guess they span 2 bars. So I add some expression later on to give them some more emotion and that sort of like swelling feel, but right now I'm just kind of sketching out some ideas. And then the next main element here was the basses. And these were a bit too loud in this version, and I fixed that later on, but they're just sort of some drony, distorted saw basses with a sub underneath. And then this bass pluck kind of comes in partway through, which is just playing kind of a different rhythm to keep things interesting and moving as things kind of progress along. So that's pretty much it for this project, so I'll go ahead and move on to the next version. Alright, so here's version 6 of the Only Now project, and not a ton has changed from here, from the last project. I added a couple more elements. I started working on some percussion, and I started sketching out a sort of drop idea and added a couple other elements here and there. I changed around the volume of the vocal a bit to make it fit a little bit better. In the last version there were a lot of just level issues in general, so I worked on that a little bit. And yeah, so I'll go ahead and play from about here through to the first 8 bars of the drop so you can get kind of an idea of where we're at.
Restless nights can't catch my mind when it starts to crumble. It starts to crumble. I can't fight this war inside, but I try to tighten my grip and stay above water when all the voices get too loud and all the walls are falling down. Your touch saves me somehow. Of course, it's only now.
So you can see kind of the basic idea. Was just playing around with some ideas here. I end up changing quite a bit about this section in particular in the final version, but I'll kind of talk about some of these new elements. So one of the main ones is this piano. I kind of changed this around a little bit, so it's got a little bit more going on. And that's pretty much the melody, if you want to call it that, for the intro of the final version. And I believe I also added in some automation here. Yep. So these cellos that I was talking about in the last video now have some expression applied to them, which is basically a fancy volume control for string libraries. So it sounds like this now. And it's a little abrupt as of right now, and it sounds alright in context. But still needs a little bit of work. Next element that I added was this ARP here. And it's just got a automation filter that's cutting off a lot of the highs and just kind of bringing it in slowly over time as it sort of builds towards this transition here. And it's a pretty basic preset from Sylenth. I mean, it's some pulse waves and a saw wave that are just being arpeggiated. It's really helps to add kind of a building element to this section. And then the next thing of note to add, that was added were these kind of cinematic drums. And I end up polishing these up a little bit. This was really just throwing some samples down and getting kind of an idea across. But yeah, that's pretty much it there. I do a lot more work on those later on that we'll kind of talk about. The next thing was the chords. So I've got this sort of supersaw stack that's being filtered in here. and it's playing the main chord progression of the track in sort of a offbeat, stuttery kind of way, and just sort of filtering in over time to sort of build anticipation towards the drop. And then I was playing around with this idea of kind of playing them in a sort of choppy way in this beginning part of the drop to kind of throw off the listener a little bit, and then bring in everything full force over in this part here. But I ended up scrapping that and going for a different idea that I'll talk about in a little bit. And there isn't a ton going on in this chord stack quite yet. I've got one supersaw layer, some noise, trombone, which adds a lot of nice low end. It's got like a really nice low mid, and this wide bass that I believe is a serum patch. Yep. And I've got this narrow bass here that I think is also more serum. Yep, and it's like just a weird wavetable that I've got going through a Camel Crusher and an OTT. And it just adds a nice sort of mid, like right down the middle kind of a bass sound, and then I've got a sub here. It's a massive patch going through a distortion and some more saturation. So that's pretty much it for this version. There's some other stuff, but a lot of these drums end up getting replaced, so I'll talk about those a little bit more in the next project where the drop is a little bit more fleshed out. So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. So here is version 10. It's now got a full arrangement, as you can kind of see. I've got an intro, a build, drop, breakdown, and then a second build and drop, and then the outro going. So the arrangement's pretty much done. I don't think I make much changes to the arrangement of the tune. After this point in the project, I just make modifications to some of the elements in each of the sections, but this is the basic layout of the whole thing. So I'll go ahead and play from kind of the middle of the build here through the drop, and then to the first part of the breakdown, so you can kind of get an idea of where we're at. So that gets you kind of the basic idea. I'll play some more of this section here in a later version, but yeah, so you can kind of hear there are a lot more elements, a lot of additional things that were added. It's a little bit more fleshed out in terms of mix. It's still kind of rough in a few places, and it's a little crunchy in terms of the supersaw stack here. There are a few bass elements that are a little too loud, but the general idea is there. You can kind of hear here at this transition between the build and the drop the kind of final-ish idea. I make some modifications to it to make it a little bit more smooth in the final version, but the idea was to sort of have the vocal ring out for the first part of the drop and then sort of filter in the supersaw chords as the vocal was kind of trailing out to just kind of give a little bit of a different feel and not necessarily hit right on the downbeat of the drop. So I'll start breaking down some of these additional elements. So the first one I want to talk about, and this was in the last version, I just forgot to mention it, but there's this sort of vocal riser that I made by looping a section of the main vocal, and then just adding a whole bunch of effects in this effects rack here. And the way that I did this was I have a filter that's sort of gradually introducing the lower frequencies of that vocal, and it's then getting a whole bunch more reverb. It's got a bit reduction on it. It's got a flanger and then a chorus, and they're all kind of automating different parameters, mostly the dry wet, and I think nothing on the actual flanger, but it's just adding a really just cool effect, and it's not super present in the mix, but you can kind of hear it in the background and just adds a nice sort of element to the build. So then the next bit I'll talk about is the lead that I've got here. So this is what it sounds like on its own. So super reverbed out, and it's kind of following the main chord progression, and just like the chord that's being filtered in over time, and then there's a little pitch bend, I believe, on this element right here as it kind of comes in, and it's just got, you know, a ton of reverb on each of these individual elements, and these are some different leads that I sort of layered together. So this is a serum patch that is just adding a nice high end, and then I've got this other lead that's much more of the body, and then this other element that's adding some different frequencies. It's got more of a pulsy quality to it, and is a little wider. And then I've got this guitar here. It's a super distorted guitar with yet more reverb. It just adds a nice sort of tone to the layer overall. So again, all together. And I do more work on those to mix them in better and tamp down some of the reverb in later versions that I'll kind of talk about. But that was the main gist of that. And then the next thing that I'll talk about is the chord stack. So I think I did a little bit more mixing to this and made it a little bit more fleshed out, and it sounds like this now. And it's got an additional super saw layer here now, as well as just some additional, I think, group processing on the bus to kind of glue everything together. And there's a few elements in here that are a little too loud, and I do more mixing on this as I go in the project. But the other thing to note is all of the automation that I've got on here. So there's this filter sweep down here. And then I've also got this LFO that I automate on and off to give it that kind of stuttery effect. And I'm automating it down. I was playing around with some other levels of automation and kind of bringing it in, but it sounded best when I just sort of kicked it in for the last little bit here when I have the bass fill come in. So here's what it sounds like. And that's just turning this LFO off and on to give it that stutter effect. And yeah, and I'm just adding in some other automations here and there to just mix things up and keep things interesting. So like here, when I do this sort of stutter, I have the filter bringing it in slowly, so it's not just playing it straight. So it's just bringing in the high frequency slowly as that sort of choppy effect hits. And then the next bit I'll talk about are the bass fills that I added. So some of these were audio, some of them were like growls that I made in Serum. So here's this first one. And some of these were samples that I kind of chopped up. So like this one was a Cashmere sample that I took like an LFO tool to, and I think probably some OTT, and just kind of made it a little choppy. Then this one is a growl that I made in Serum that I can show you here real quick. So it's just got an LFO modulating a whole bunch of parameters and kind of giving it that movement. And then the next thing I'll talk about are the drums as well as the kick. So here I've got it bounced out, but this was a kick I made in Kick 2, and I just bounced it out because my license for Kick 2 isn't working right now. So this is kind of what the kick sounds like. So it's nothing too special, but in this particular track, the kick wasn't as upfront as it is in some other styles of EDM, so I wasn't super concerned about it. But it fills the role really nicely. It's got a nice kind of punch to it. So the snares were a layer of a couple different ones. The main body is I think a virtual riot snare. Yep, and then it's got some other sort of acoustic elements to just give it a little bit more character. You can sort of hear it. It doesn't make a huge difference, but it just gives it a little bit more of a transient and fills in some of the sustain of it with some additional character there. So there's that, and then there are some of these drum fills, and these were I basically just went on Splice and looked for like tom drum fills, and then I took the ones that I liked and chopped them up a little bit to make them fit with the feel I was going for, and then layered them up with a couple other ones. So here's what some of them sound like. And they don't sound super great in when they're soloed out like this, but when they're in context, they kind of sell it a little bit more. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this version. I can talk about the arrangement a little bit. So I've got a breakdown section here. It's a pretty generous breakdown, but I tend to like those. Those are sort of my favorite parts of tracks. So I've got this piano playing some different melodies from the intro, but very similar. I've got some pluck elements that are coming in here that I introduced in this build as well. And they're just sort of very low in the mix and being filtered in slowly over time with this automation curve here, so you can kind of hear them rising as things kind of build. And I also have these strings coming in here. So I've got these solo cellos that here you can see I did a lot more work with the expression to give it more of a natural feel for these cellos. And then I also added in this like full string section partway through the drop to just again increase the emotion of this track by doing like some string swells here. So and I've also got these similar orchestral drums, and you can see here I kind of chopped them up a little bit more and made them fit with what I was kind of envisioning for this particular section. And they're being filtered in slowly over time to again just slowly introduce new elements and keep things interesting. And yeah, that's pretty much it. And then the second drop is very similar to the first, but I just go straight into it rather than doing that sort of pause and filter in effect. And I'll play that for you real quick here. One thing I did forget to mention is I added in this sort of fill ARP here, which is something that's very common in the melodic dubstep kind of genre. You'll hear it all over the place if you start listening for it, but AU5 does it a lot, Seven Lions does it a lot. It's just a really cool effect, and it's nothing super complicated. It's just playing up some different notes in the scale really quickly with a heavily reverbed pluck effect that just gives a nice kind of fill element to transitions and things like that to keep things interesting. So yeah, the other thing is I took the vocal chop that was actually kind of in the sample and I chopped it up even more just to fit with the rhythm I was going for, added some reverb and automated that off and on. Because I didn't want it to be super present, I just wanted it to be kind of in the background so you could hear it, but it wasn't the main focus. The main focus is on the lead element and the chords and drums and all that stuff. It's just sort of taken a back seat. So yeah, with that, I'll go ahead and move on to the next project. All right, so here is version 19 of my Only Now remix. So as you can see, not much has changed in terms of the arrangement, but I'll go ahead and play you through some of the highlights here so you can kind of see what's changed. Alright, so that kind of gives you an idea of where we're at. Still a little bit of a ways to go, but getting there for sure. The mix is a little bit cleaner, the transitions are a little bit smoother. Overall, it's just a little bit more polished, but there's still some stuff to be done. So first thing I'll talk about is this transition here in the first drop. So I added some reverb to this tail, and I also added a basically a copy of this main vocal but pitched up 12 semitones just to add in some additional harmonic content to this so that the reverb just has a nice full sound that sort of washes into the main part of the drop. So let me just play this again for you real quick. And I also cleaned up this filter transition here. It's still a little abrupt, but it's definitely more solid. It basically completely filters out the whole of the supersaw stack for this first little bit here, and then slowly brings it in over time just to make it a little bit of a smoother transition. And I also added in that ARP run that I talked about in the last video. And I just kind of cut it off there with, I believe, a utility probably, just to mute it. Yeah, I'm just cutting it off and muting it with a utility just to kill that reverb tail, because that's when everything else kind of kicks in full force, and I didn't need that in there. It just was cluttering things up unnecessarily. So yeah, that was the main thing there. Next was the drums here in the build. So I added in some of those orchestral drums into the build section here. And I also added some bus compression, or just some bus processing to these orchestral drums in general. So I added some glue compression to beef them up a little bit, as well as some saturation and a little bit, well, this is kind of a generous amount of OTT, just to bring them up in level and just make them sound a little bit more full. So here, let me play this section with that group processing turned off, and it's going to be a little quieter. So it just beefs them up a little bit, really makes them punch a little bit more, and it does bring them up in volume as well, so there's that to take into consideration. So the next bit is I added these staccato cellos in this build here. And this is just another element to add partway through the build to just build up that energy and keep things moving forward. And yeah, it just sounds really good in context. So here's what it is in context. And without. So it's not super present, but you can hear it, and it really adds energy. And overall, the drop is just a little bit more polished. The chords sound a little bit better. And yeah, that's pretty much it for this project. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. All right, so here is version 25. This actually isn't the final version that I submitted to the remix competition, or that's posted to my SoundCloud. I did, for this track specifically, a dedicated mixing session where I bounced out this project into stems and then did some additional mixing and then a master after that. I don't do that with all of my tracks. Sometimes I think it's necessary, and especially in this track where I was doing lots of like quick cuts for things like the supersaws. And when you're doing that with, since you sometimes get little extra tails that you can't always catch with like a mute automation on and off, and it can sometimes cause clicks and pops as well. So for this track specifically, because I had a lot of that sort of stuff going on, you can see even here, kind of in the preview of this area right here, there's lots of kind of cuts in between these different clips. So there were lots of just little clicks and pops that were happening as a result of that. So it just gave me an opportunity to go through and sort of remove those and put in some small fades so that you didn't get those clicks. And yeah, just gave me an opportunity to clean up some other stuff as well. And it's sometimes nice to be able to work in a completely new session, especially when you've been staring at a project for a long time. So I'll open that project up after this one. But yeah, let me just show you through some of the different sections here. I'll just play some quick highlights so you can sort of see where it's at. Alright, so that's kind of the gist here. So a few things that were added in this version was I added this little drop accent piano thing here along with this bell that I'll just sort of solo out here real quick. And this just added a nice additional element to the drop to kind of, again, keep things moving and keep things interesting. So let me play this here. And then in context. And it's just a nice additional element that adds some interest and just some cool atmosphere to this end section of the drop here. And same thing with this bell. I just kind of liked how it sounded when there was an additional sort of element echoing the same melody as this piano here. So the next thing is kind of an all-encompassing topic, is just did some more mixing overall, changed some EQs, changed some levels here and there. Nothing too drastic, but just makes things seem a little bit more polished, and I don't want to go through every single layer of every single thing to kind of showcase what was done. The next thing I'll talk about is the outro here. So I didn't really touch on this much in the last video when I played this, but it's really a kind of reverse of the intro section where the atmosphere kind of comes back in and there's this piano playing, and then the ARP is kind of fading out, and that's sort of a theme of the outro in general, is that stuff's fading out. So I've got this copy of the vocal here that's got a bunch of reverb on it, and it's being faded out over time with a automation here on the group. So it's taken away some of the high frequencies to make everything sort of fade into the distance. Yeah, and that was pretty much it. I mean, we've talked about a lot of these elements already. It's mostly just recycled stuff from the beginning of the track, just kind of rearranged and yeah, made to fit into kind of this very gentle kind of outro feel. So yeah, that's, I think, pretty much it for this version. I mean, there's nothing major that changed in this version versus the last. A lot of it's very similar. It's just polishing some things here and there and making stuff fit a little bit better. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. All right, so here is the final version of my Only Now remix. So you can see I've got these stems here that are bounced out, and I've got some pretty basic mixing on some of these channels just to make things fit a little bit better. Nothing drastic, just some EQ tweaks here and there with some additional saturation and volume automation just to make things fit and keep everything kind of glued together. And then I've also got my final master that I actually stuck on here for whatever reason. So I've got the master going here, and I'll go through this a little bit more in detail at the end. But yeah, so on the drums, I've got a low cut with a little bit of a high Q here to boost some of those kind of sub frequencies that are in things like the snare and the orchestral drums. And then I've got a little bit of a boost here as well to just bring out some presence in some of those drums. And then I'm also doing a technique called New York compression here, which is essentially parallel compression where you've got a dry signal and a wet signal, and then the wet signal is just a highly compressed version of the input signal with some of the lows and the low mids cut out. So let me just play that real quick for you so you can hear what just the wet signal sounds like. And it just adds some presence to the drums that really makes them feel more full and polished. So let me just solo out this section, and I'll just turn this off and on real quick. And it's just a technique that I like to do a lot on drums in particular, as this technique sounds really good. Looks like I didn't really do too much to the kick. It's pretty much exactly the way that it was in the final version after I bounced it. The basses here, I did a little bit of, looks like stereo imaging to mono out some of the subs and widen up the mids a little bit. Yeah, so you can kind of hear when I turn those off. But there's a lot of low end in the sides that I was just trying to get rid of with this particular move here, and then I did the same thing with this utility here just to narrow the entire channel down a little bit, and then give it a little bit of a gain boost as well. Looks like the drop bass fills, there's not really anything done to these. The chords, so these I did, I think, a little bit of stereo imaging as well as some hard clipping. So this is pretty much doing a similar thing to what I was doing on the basses, where I'm trying to get rid of some of the very lows in the sides and then just widen up the rest of the supersaws. So here's what they sound like. And I'll turn all this off and on. So everything's a little bit more focused, in my opinion, and just sounds a little bit tighter overall. This G-clip is just a hard clipping plugin. This is just to kind of achieve a lot of loudness, and I was essentially trying to cut off some of the peaks from the supersaws in particular, because they were triggering my mastering limiter a little bit too often, and I was basically just trying to shade those off, and that has the added benefit of getting you a little bit of extra loudness and just flattens out the signal a little bit, so it's a little easier to process later on. And then here with these EQs, I was just doing a little high boost in the high end and cutting a high frequency here that I wasn't a huge fan of. So next thing are the pads or harmonic elements that I listed in here. These are basically the strings. And here I did a little bit of EQ as well as some stereo widening and saturation, and then a boost on the sides. So this is what they sound like off and on. This is with them off. And it just widens things up and makes them sound more present and full. So next thing is the melodic elements. So this is things like the piano, the lead, the arp, things that are very present in the mix. So again, some EQ stuff here. I have this Pro Q here. So there was this really strange kind of resonant whistle sound that was happening right here. So if I turn this off, you might be able to make it out. It's like right here. And I wasn't a huge fan of that, and it kind of poked out in the mix. So what I did, and it was only in the left channel, so what I did is I have a dynamic EQ here in Pro Q just on the left channel, and it's just automated off and on, so it isn't affecting this all the time. It's just in this one section where I found that weird artifact, and it's basically just tamping down those frequencies for this little bit here so that you can't really hear it as much. And yeah, then I'm doing some stereo widening as well as a gain boost, then more stereo imaging here, very similar. process to the rest. I'm monoing out the sub frequencies, narrowing up the mids a little bit, and then doing a little bit of widening on the high end. Then here I've got a isotope. This is like their analog, or they call it vintage EQ, and I was just doing a few little, looks like I just did a high boost here at 12K just to give a little bit more presence. This automation, I believe, is just on during the breakdown section. And this was just to add a little bit of presence for those elements during the breakdown section. Then at the very end, I've got a G-clip, and this is just being applied to the lead and the drop. I could have separated this out into two separate channels, but I just found this easier. But it's basically doing a similar thing. It's just cutting off some of those peaks that were happening in this particular stem to even things out a little bit and just add a little bit of loudness. So yeah. Last couple channels here are the atmospheric elements. Didn't really do much with these, I just boosted them a little bit. Same thing with these, I didn't really change anything with the atmosphere. And then the vocals, I've got a little bit of gain automation here to turn things up and down. I didn't like how loud these vocal chops were during the drop, so I turned those down a little bit. And then narrowed the vocal a little bit to just make it so it's a little bit more in the center and a little bit more present. So yeah, that's pretty much it for mixing. I've got some automation here on the group that's just basically being used for the build. So I've got a low cut here that's filtering out some of the low end with a resonance, and then doing a gain automation here to basically bring the gain down as the build progresses to build tension and basically make it so that the first note of the drop really hits. And then this little stutter here, I'm doing a gain automation here to give it that kind of cinematic stutter effect that I'll just play real quick. So yeah, and like I was saying in the last video, I added some fades here to get rid of some of these clicks and pops at the beginning. So even though I was using a like LFO tool, there was still a little bit of a signal here at the beginning, and if I bring this back, you might be able to see it. Yeah, you can barely see it there, but there's a little bit of a click that happens right here. So basically what I did for this was I created cuts and then faded on the edges for all of these different sections where I saw those clicks, and basically just got rid of them so that they weren't causing any issues in the mix. And yeah, so the master is probably the last thing to go over. So I've got some stereo imaging here. I've got a Pro Q doing some very gentle boosts. I have a few little cuts here to just get rid of a few resonant frequencies I found. A Oxford inflator again to do some saturation. A mid-side OTT, which is basically just doing some gentle OTT on the mids versus the sides. Then some multiband compression, followed by a glue compressor that's adding some soft clipping and some loudness. And then a G-clip again that's doing some hard clipping to give it even more loudness. And then this utility here is being used for gain automation before the drop, like I said, to really bring up the tension as the build progresses, and then the drop will hit, in this case, 5 dB, basically louder than the build was, to really make it hit super hard. So yeah, the last thing is a limiter. Got true peak enabled with oversampling, and just doing really only 2 0.7 dBs of gain into the limiter, because I'm doing a lot of the loudness with the other plugins in the chain here. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So with that, I'll just finish out the video. If you have any questions about any of the different elements or want me to go in detail with any of them, I went through a lot of these projects pretty quick, so don't have an opportunity to go through and talk about each of the elements in super detail. So if there's any particular one you would like me to go over, please feel free to leave a comment and just let me know, and I'll try my best to create a video specifically for that element. So with that, I will just go ahead and play the outro, and thank you guys for watching.